They had already decided he was guilty before the sun even touched the canyon walls. Before we go any further, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere quiet, somewhere warm. Because out here, justice doesn't wait for answers, it waits for silence. And silence is what they gave him. Ethan Cole knelt in the dust, hands bound behind his back, the coarse rope biting into his wrists as the desert wind dragged heat across his skin. The fire in front of him cracked low and steady, not wild, not angry, just patient, like everything else in this place. 40 Apache warriors stood in a wide circle, unmoving, their shadows stretching long across the red earth as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the ridge. No one spoke. No one needed to. At Ethan's feet lay the reason he was there. A sacred stone talisman, broken clean through, its edges rough, its meaning heavier than anything a man could carry. He hadn't meant to touch it, hadn't meant to even see it. But now it was here, and so was he. The chief stood across the fire, tall, still, his presence heavier than the silence itself. His eyes didn't burn with anger. They didn't need to. They carried something colder. Certainty. Out here, certainty was more dangerous than rage. Ethan lifted his head just enough to meet that gaze, not defiant, not pleading, just steady. I didn't break it, he said, voice low, worn from dust and distance. The words didn't echo. They didn't travel. They simply fell between them and disappeared, like water into sand. No one shifted. No one questioned. Because the story had already been told, just not by him. High above, on the canyon ridge, they had seen what they needed to see. A white cowboy, a sacred object in his hand, and a child on the ground. That was enough. It was always enough. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of sage and smoke through the circle. Ethan felt it, subtle, grounding, reminding him of something quieter than fear. 3 hours earlier, the world had been different. Just cattle tracks, dry rock, and the long stretch of land that didn't belong to anyone but the sky. Then came the sound. Not loud, not clear, but wrong. A child's cry doesn't belong in a canyon that empty. He had followed it without thinking, boots slipping over loose stone, breath catching as he climbed down into the narrow cut, where shadows held onto the last of the day. That's where he saw the boy. Small, barely 10, trapped between fallen rock and shifting dirt, one leg pinned, chest rising in short, uneven breaths. And beside him, half buried in the dust, the talisman. Ethan didn't think about rules, didn't think about borders, didn't think about anything but the way the boy's fingers clawed weakly at the air. He dropped to his knees, digging with bare hands, stone cutting into his palms, dust filling his lungs as he worked fast, faster than fear could catch up. The rock shifted, the ground gave, and when the boy finally came free, Ethan pulled him close, steadying him, making sure he was breathing, alive, still here. Only then did he notice the talisman. It had come loose in the slide, cracked where the stone had struck it. He picked it up without thinking, just to keep it from being lost in the dirt, just long enough to understand what it was, just long enough for someone else to see. Back in the present, the fire snapped louder, a single spark lifting into the darkening sky. The chief took one step forward. Not fast, not slow, measured, final. Sacred law, he said quietly, is not broken by accident. The words settled over the circle like weight. Ethan felt the rope tighten slightly as one of the warriors behind him adjusted his grip, not out of cruelty, but out of certainty. And that was the difference. Out here, no one needed to hate you to end you. They only needed to believe they were right. Ethan exhaled slowly, dust rising faintly around him. He could still feel the boy's weight in his arms, still see the fear in his eyes, still hear that cry echoing through the canyon. But none of that mattered now, not unless someone chose to see it. And right now, no one was looking. The fire did not grow louder, but somehow it felt closer, like it had leaned in to listen, like even the flames were waiting to see if the truth would dare show itself. And Ethan Cole stayed on his knees, not because the rope forced him to, but because standing would have changed nothing at all. And out here a man learned quickly when movement mattered and when it did not. The sun slipped lower behind the canyon wall, painting everything in a dull copper light, and the warriors around him did not shift, did not whisper, did not question, because they had been raised on something stronger than doubt, something older than fairness, and that was the law that bound them tighter than any rope ever could. Ethan let his eyes drift, not searching for escape, not measuring distance, but remembering details, because sometimes details were all a man had left when no one believed his words, and he remembered the way the boy's hand had reached out, fingers trembling, not in fear of him, but in fear of being left alone under that weight of stone and dust. He remembered the sound of shifting rock, the way the canyon had seemed to hold its breath while he dug, every second stretched thin between life and something else he did not want to name. He had not seen any warriors then, had not heard any voices, only the wind scraping along the rock and that small, fragile breath that told him the boy was still fighting to stay. That was the part no one here had seen, not the ridge watchers, not the ones standing around him now. They had seen the ending of a moment, not the beginning, and out here the beginning was the only part that told the truth. A faint movement passed through the circle, subtle enough that most would have missed it, but Ethan noticed, because a man who lived alone long enough learned to read silence like other men read books, and somewhere behind the chief, a figure shifted half a step forward, then stopped, as if held in place by something stronger than fear. Ethan did not turn his head, did not break the line of his posture, but he felt it, the weight of a gaze that was not filled with certainty, not filled with judgment, but something quieter, something that did not fit the story the others had already accepted. The chief lowered his eyes briefly to the broken talisman, then back to Ethan, and there was a pause there, just a breath longer than before, and in that breath lived the only space where doubt could exist. But doubt was a dangerous thing in a place built on belief, and it rarely survived long enough to speak. "You carried it," the chief said, voice even, not accusing, not asking, simply stating what had already been decided. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate. "I picked it up after the rock slide," he answered, every word placed carefully, not rushed, not defensive, because truth did not need speed, it only needed to stand. The wind moved again, lifting a thin veil of dust between them, softening the edges of everything except the fire, which remained sharp, steady, unblinking. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried once, then fell silent, as if even the sky had chosen not to interfere. Ethan felt the rope shift slightly as the man behind him adjusted his stance, not tightening, not loosening, just maintaining, because this was not about punishment yet. This was about certainty becoming action, and once that line was crossed, there would be no turning back. He exhaled slowly, letting the air leave him in a controlled breath, the same way he had done 100 times before when facing storms, or empty land, or nights that stretched longer than they should. And he realized something then, something simple, something clear, that the truth he carried was not enough on its own, not unless someone else chose to carry it with him. And right now the circle remained closed, unbroken, complete in its belief. But that gaze behind the chief did not leave him, and it did not feel like judgment. It felt like waiting. The circle did not break, but something inside it began to shift, slow as the sun slipping behind the ridge, quiet as breath held too long, and Ethan Cole felt it before he saw it. That subtle change in the air that comes when certainty starts to crack, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, careful ways that most men ignore until it is too late. The chief remained still, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, yet the silence around his last words stretched longer than it should have, as if even the land itself was waiting for something more than a simple answer. Ethan did not rush to fill it. He had learned that lesson the hard way, out on open land where speaking too quickly often cost more than staying quiet. So he let the silence stand. Let it breathe. Let it become something heavier than accusation. The broken talisman at his feet caught the last edge of sunlight, the fracture line glinting faintly, and for a moment it looked less like a symbol of law and more like something that had simply been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But meaning did not come from the object. It came from the people who believed in it. And right now, their belief was stronger than his truth. A warrior stepped forward from the left side of the circle, his movement measured, controlled, carrying neither anger nor hesitation, only purpose, and in his hands he held something wrapped in worn leather, tied with a thin strip of braided cord. He stopped a few feet from Ethan and lowered the bundle carefully to the ground, unwrapping it with slow precision, revealing a second piece of the talisman, smaller, darker, its edge matching the break at Ethan's feet as clean as a shadow fits its shape. A murmur did not rise, because these people did not murmur, but the weight of attention shifted, drawing tighter, sharper, more focused than before. The warrior looked at the chief, then at Ethan, and finally at the broken pieces, as if placing them together again in his mind, forming a story that felt complete, a story that did not require explanation. It was whole at sunrise, the warrior said, his voice low, carrying just far enough for all to hear, and that was all he offered. No accusation, no demand, just a fact placed into the space between them, heavy enough to tip the balance further away from Ethan's words. The chief inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement, and for the first time, his gaze dropped from Ethan's face to his hands, the dirt still packed beneath his fingernails, the thin cuts along his palms, the marks left by stone and effort rather than force. But those details were quiet things, and quiet things were easy to overlook when a louder truth had already taken hold. Ethan followed that gaze, not to defend himself, not to point anything out, but simply because it was there, because it existed, whether anyone chose to see it or not. He flexed his fingers slightly, feeling the stiffness in them, the lingering ache from the canyon, and the memory came back again, sharper this time, the moment when the ground had shifted under his knees, when the boy's breath had nearly stopped, when there had been no time to consider what belonged to whom, only whether that small life would continue or end beneath the weight of stone. He could say all of that. He could try, but he knew it would not matter. Not yet, because truth, out here, did not travel through words alone. It needed something else, something stronger than memory. Behind the chief, that same presence shifted again, a step more certain this time, though still restrained, still held back by something unseen, and Ethan felt it clearly now, that gaze that did not match the others, that did not settle comfortably into the story being built around him. It lingered on his hands, on the dirt, on the details that did not belong to a man who had come to destroy something sacred. The chief straightened slightly, his decision drawing closer to the surface, and the fire cracked once, louder than before, sending a brief spray of sparks into the cooling air, and in that brief flash of light, something changed, not in the circle, not in the law, but in the space just beyond it, where someone who had seen more than the others was finally deciding whether silence was still the right choice. The fire settled into a lower burn, steady and patient, and with it the moment grew heavier, stretching thin between what had been seen and what had not yet been understood, and Ethan Cole remained where he was, shoulders relaxed despite the rope, not in surrender, but in something quieter, something harder to break, because a man who knew the truth did not need to fight for it. Not yet. Not until someone else chose to listen. The chief's eyes lingered on Ethan's hands longer this time, not searching for guilt, but noticing something that did not belong to the story that had already been formed. The dirt pressed deep beneath the nails, the uneven marks across his palms, not the kind that came from taking, but from holding on, from pulling something free that did not want to come loose. The second fragment of the talisman lay beside the first now, placed carefully, their edges aligned just enough to show what had been lost, and for a brief moment, the broken line between them felt less like a crime and more like a question that had not been asked properly. The warrior who had brought the second piece stepped back into the circle without another word, his duty done, his part in the story placed where it belonged, and still no one spoke further, because here, words were not given lightly, and when they were, they carried weight that could not be taken back. Ethan let his gaze lower, not in defeat, but to the ground where the fragments rested, and he saw again the slope of the canyon, the way the stone had shifted, the way the talisman had been caught between rock and earth, struck not by intent, but by chance, by movement that did not care who it affected. He could describe it. He could paint the moment with every detail his memory held. But memory was not proof here. Memory belonged to the one who carried it. And he stood alone in that. Behind the chief, the woman who had been watching stepped forward at last, just one pace. But it was enough to change the shape of the circle, enough to pull a few quiet glances in her direction, though no one spoke her name. She did not rush, did not call out. She simply stood where she could see more clearly, her eyes moving from the broken talisman to Ethan's hands, then to his face, searching not for an answer, but for something that matched what she had already begun to suspect. Ethan felt her presence fully now, not as judgment, but as weight, as a tension that carried something different, something that had not yet chosen a side. The chief noticed her movement. Of course he did, and his gaze shifted slightly, not in warning, but in acknowledgement, as if recognizing that whatever came next would not come from him alone. The wind eased, the heat of the day giving way to the first hint of evening cool, and with it came a stillness that settled deeper than before, a stillness that made even the smallest sound stand out, the crack of the fire, the soft shift of leather, the distant call of something unseen beyond the ridge. Ethan drew in a slow breath, steady, measured, and spoke again, not louder, not stronger, just clearer. He was trapped, he said, the words simple, placed carefully into the space that had been left open. The ground gave way. I pulled him out. He did not point, did not defend, did not look to the circle for approval. He let the words stand on their own, thin as they were against the weight of what had already been decided. For a moment, nothing changed. The circle held. The fire burned. The chief remained still. But the woman behind him did not look away, and in her gaze, something aligned. Something connected the marks on Ethan's hands with the quiet truth behind his words. And though she did not speak yet, though she did not break the silence, the balance had begun to shift, not enough for anyone else to feel it, not enough to stop what might come next, but enough that the story was no longer complete. Enough that what had been certain a few moments ago now carried the faintest edge of doubt and doubt. Here, even the smallest doubt could change everything, if someone was willing to give it a voice. The silence did not break, but it changed shape, like wind shifting direction without warning. And Ethan Cole felt it in the way the air moved across his face, lighter now, less certain, as if something unseen had stepped between him and the judgment that had been closing in. The woman behind the chief took another step forward, slow enough that no one could call it defiance, careful enough that it still respected the circle, but there was intention in it now, something that no longer hid behind stillness. Her eyes did not leave Ethan's hands. Not once. She saw what others had not chosen to see. The chief remained motionless, yet his attention had shifted, not away from Ethan, but toward her, acknowledging her presence without granting her the space to speak just yet. That was the balance here. No one interrupted the law, not even those who questioned it. Ethan lowered his gaze again, not out of submission, but because he understood something most men did not. Truth needed patience, and patience often looked like silence. The fire crackled low, its glow casting long shadows that stretched and pulled across the ground, touching the broken pieces of the talisman as if trying to draw them back together. But some things, once broken, did not return the same. The wind carried a faint sound from beyond the ridge, distant hooves, or perhaps just the echo of movement carried across miles of open land, but no one turned to look. This moment held them all in place. The woman finally spoke, her voice quiet, but clear enough to reach the center of the circle without force. His hands, she said, not loud, not accusing, just stating what she had seen. The words did not challenge the chief. They did not deny the law. They simply added something that had not been there before. A detail, a truth that did not fit. Several of the warriors shifted slightly, not breaking formation, but adjusting, as if her words had introduced something they could not ignore. The chief's eyes moved again to Ethan's hands, this time longer, deeper, and something within that gaze changed, not entirely, not enough to undo what had been decided, but enough to slow it. Stone does not cut like that, the woman continued, her voice steady now, stronger, but still respectful, still within the boundaries of what could be said. Ethan did not look up. He did not react. He let her words exist without attaching himself to them, because if they came from him, they would carry less weight. But from her, they were something else, something harder to dismiss. The chief took a slow breath, his chest rising beneath the worn leather and fabric, and for the first time, the certainty in his posture showed the faintest sign of strain, not weakness, but consideration. He stepped closer to the fire, the light catching the lines of his face, deepening them, revealing the years behind his decisions, the weight of every judgment he had ever made. "You speak carefully," he said to the woman, his voice even, but there was something beneath it now, not challenge, but invitation. She did not lower her gaze. She did not step back. "I speak what I see," she answered, and that was all. No defense. No explanation. Just truth, placed beside another truth that had already been accepted. The circle held its breath again. Ethan felt it, the space widening, the story stretching beyond its original shape. And for the first time since they had bound his hands, the outcome did not feel fixed. Not safe. Not certain. Just open. The chief's gaze returned to Ethan, but it was different now. Not searching for guilt. Not confirming it. Looking for something else. Something that had not been part of the original story. Ethan finally lifted his head, just enough to meet that gaze again. Steady, unchanged, and in that moment, he did not look like a man asking to be believed. He looked like a man who already knew the truth did not belong to him alone anymore. And somewhere beyond the fire, beyond the circle, beyond the weight of law and silence, something else was approaching, not in sound, not in sight, but in the quiet realization that what they had seen might not have been the whole story after all. The fire burned lower, but the weight around it grew heavier, pressing down on every man standing in that circle. And Ethan Cole could feel the moment narrowing, tightening, as if the land itself was deciding whether it would allow the truth to pass through or bury it where it stood. The chief did not speak right away, and that silence was no longer empty. It was full, crowded with doubt, with observation, with the quiet presence of something that had not existed when this began. The woman remained where she stood, her posture steady, her eyes unwavering, and though she had said only a few words, they had done more than any argument ever could. They had slowed the law. Not stopped it, but slowed it enough that it could be seen clearly. Ethan stayed still, his breathing even, his gaze calm, not because he felt safe, but because he understood something deeper than fear. Panic never convinced anyone. Stillness sometimes did. A faint sound carried across the edge of the circle, so soft at first it could have been mistaken for wind brushing against dry brush. But then it came again, uneven, hesitant, like footsteps that did not yet trust the ground beneath them. A few heads turned. Not sharply, not breaking formation, but enough to acknowledge that something had entered the space beyond what had already been decided. The chief did not turn. He waited. That was his way. Let whatever approached reveal itself fully before giving it weight. Ethan did not move either, but something in his chest shifted, not hope, not yet, but recognition, like hearing an echo you remember before you understand it. The sound came closer, slow, uneven, and then from between the outer edge of the warriors, a small figure stepped forward, hesitant, shoulders tight, eyes lowered at first, as if unsure whether he was allowed to be there at all. The boy. Dust still clung to his clothes. His steps were careful, measured, each one placed as though he expected the ground to move again beneath him. The circle did not open, but it made space, subtle, respectful, because the presence of a child did not break the law, but it could shift how it was seen. The woman's gaze softened slightly when she saw him, but she did not move, did not call out, because this moment did not belong to her anymore. It belonged to him. The boy stopped a few feet behind the chief, close enough to be seen, far enough to remain outside the center, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. The fire cracked once, sharp in the quiet, and the boy flinched, just slightly, a small movement, but enough to tell the truth his voice had not yet carried. The chief finally turned, not quickly, not with surprise, but with a measured awareness, as if he had already sensed this coming. His eyes lowered to the boy, studying him, not as a witness, not yet, but as something that might become one. You were there, the chief said, his voice steady, not questioning, simply placing the fact into the space between them. The boy swallowed, his throat moving visibly, and for a moment, he did not answer. His eyes lifted slowly, not to the chief, but past him, toward Ethan, and something passed between them, something quiet, something that had nothing to do with law or judgment, but everything to do with memory. Ethan held that gaze, not urging, not asking, just present, just steady, offering nothing but the truth he already carried. The boy's hands tightened slightly at his sides, small fingers curling, uncurling, as if holding on to something unseen, something heavy for someone his size. The warriors watched, still as stone, but their attention had shifted now, drawn not to the broken talisman, not to Ethan, but to the space between the boy's silence and whatever words might follow. The chief waited. He did not press. He did not command. Because out here, truth forced was not truth at all. It had to be given. The boy took a slow breath, his shoulders rising, then falling, and though his voice had not yet come, the weight of what he carried had already begun to change everything. The boy's breath came uneven at first, like the canyon still lived inside his chest, like each inhale had to convince itself it was safe. And the circle around him did not move, did not rush him, because even the law understood that some truths needed time to find their way into words. Ethan Cole kept his eyes steady, not locking onto the boy, not pressing him forward, just present, just there, the same way he had been in the canyon when nothing else mattered except that the boy was still breathing. The fire gave a low crack, a soft shift of light brushing across the boy's face. And for the first time, he lifted his chin just enough for his voice to exist. "I dropped it," he said, barely above a whisper, the words thin, fragile, but they did not disappear. They stayed. They held. The chief did not react immediately, and that stillness carried more weight than any interruption could have. "Say it again," the chief said quietly, not because he had not heard, but because truth, once spoken, had to be strong enough to stand twice. The boy swallowed, his eyes flicking once more toward Ethan, then back to the ground where the broken pieces lay, and this time his voice found more shape. "I dropped it," he repeated, steadier now, though his hands still trembled at his sides. The wind moved through the circle, lifting dust in a thin line that passed between the fragments of the talisman, as if tracing the path of what had happened, not what had been assumed. The warriors did not speak, but their attention shifted. Again, not as one, not in agreement, but in awareness, because the story they had accepted was no longer the only one in the space. The chief's gaze lowered slowly to the talisman, then back to the boy, and there was something different there now, something that had not been present when this began, not doubt alone, but the recognition that the truth was no longer singular. "How?" the chief asked, his voice even, controlled, carrying no accusation, only the need for understanding. The boy drew in a breath, deeper this time, and the memory returned to him in pieces, not clean, not easy, but real. "The ground moved," he said, his words coming slower, each one chosen as if stepping across uncertain stone. "The rocks, they fell. I was running. I tried to hold it." His eyes lowered again, guilt flickering across his face, not for breaking the law, but for something simpler, something human. It slipped. The silence that followed was not empty anymore. It was filled with something that could not be ignored. Ethan felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, like a door opening just enough to let light through. The chief remained still, but the certainty that had once defined his posture no longer held the same edge. It had softened, not in weakness, but in understanding. The woman behind him took one slow step closer, not to speak, not to lead, but to stand nearer to the truth as it unfolded, her presence no longer restrained by hesitation. "And him," the chief said, his eyes moving toward Ethan without turning his head fully. "What did he do?" The boy hesitated again, but only for a moment, and this time when he looked at Ethan, there was no fear left in it. Only memory, only clarity. "He pulled me out," the boy said, and the words landed differently than anything before them, not soft, not fragile, but firm in their simplicity. "The rocks kept moving. I could not get free." His voice steadied further, gaining strength from the truth itself. He stayed. He did not leave. The fire cracked again, louder this time, as if marking the moment, and the circle around them did not break, but it changed, the shape of it no longer closing in, no longer pressing forward, but holding, waiting, reconsidering what had once seemed certain. Ethan did not move, did not speak. He let the boy's words stand alone, because they carried more weight than anything he could add. The chief's gaze lingered on him now, not searching for guilt, not confirming it, but measuring something else entirely, something that could not be seen from a distance, something that had only become visible when the truth was finally given a voice. And in that quiet space between the fire and the fading light, the story that had once been complete was no longer whole, and what replaced it was something far more difficult to ignore. The fire settled into a quiet glow, no longer sharp, no longer demanding, and the circle around it seemed to breathe differently now, as if something invisible had been lifted from their shoulders, not entirely gone, but no longer pressing down the same way it had before. Ethan Cole remained still, but the rope around his wrists no longer felt like a sentence waiting to be carried out. It felt like something unfinished, something that no longer belonged to the moment as it now stood. The boy's words lingered in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but steady in a way that truth often was when it did not need to fight to be heard. The chief did not speak immediately, and this time the silence was not filled with judgment, but with thought, with the careful weighing of something that could not be rushed. His eyes moved once more to the broken talisman, both pieces now resting in the dust, their edges aligned just enough to show what had been lost and what had never truly been taken. He stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, not to assert authority, but to understand the space in front of him more clearly. He knelt, not fully, but enough to reach the fragments, his hand hovering just above them before finally lifting one piece, turning it slightly in the fading light. The crack was clean, sharp, not worn, not forced, and for a moment, the object looked less like something defiled and more like something caught in a moment it could not control. The chief's gaze lifted from the stone to Ethan's hands again, then back to the boy, and in that quiet exchange, something resolved, not loudly, not in declaration, but in understanding that did not need to be spoken to exist. The woman stepped closer now, no longer held back, her presence beside the chief no longer a question, but part of the answer, and she did not look at Ethan this time. She looked at the talisman, then at the boy, and finally at the chief, as if confirming that what had been seen was now shared. The warriors did not move, but their stillness had changed, no longer rigid, no longer fixed, but open, as if waiting for something different than what they had expected when this began. The chief rose slowly, the fragment still in his hand, and turned it once more before lowering it back to the ground beside the other piece, placing them together not as evidence, but as something that needed to be seen whole before it could be judged. The fire cracked softly, and the light shifted, casting both pieces in a single glow, their break no longer dividing them, but defining a moment that had now been understood. The chief stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Ethan, not in confrontation, not in judgment, but in something quieter, something that carried weight without force. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes steady, searching not for guilt, but for truth that had already revealed itself. Ethan met that gaze without hesitation, not with pride, not with relief, just with the same steady presence he had held from the beginning, because nothing about what had happened had changed for him, only how it was now being seen. The chief's hand lifted slightly, not toward the talisman, not toward the fire, but toward the rope at Ethan's wrists, and for a moment, everything paused, the wind, the fire, the circle itself, as if waiting to see what that gesture would become. The boy stood still behind him, no longer trembling, his breath steady now, his place in the story no longer uncertain. The woman did not speak, but her gaze remained firm, grounded, as if holding the truth in place so it would not be lost again. And in that moment, the law that had once felt unbreakable did not disappear, but it changed, shaped not by accusation, not by assumption, but by something far more difficult to ignore, something that did not come from power, but from the quiet courage of being seen clearly at last. The rope came loose without a word, not cut in haste, not torn away, but untied slowly, deliberately, as if each knot carried a piece of what had just been understood, and when it finally slipped free from Ethan Cole's wrists, no one stepped forward to guide him, no one reached to push him away, because the moment did not belong to force anymore. It belonged to something quieter. He did not stand right away. He let his hands fall to his sides, flexing his fingers once, feeling the weight of his own freedom return not as relief, but as something earned through patience, through silence, through truth that had waited long enough to be seen. The chief stepped back a single pace, not as retreat, but as space given, and his gaze remained steady on Ethan, not with apology, not with pride, but with acknowledgement, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The broken talisman still lay at their feet, both pieces resting side by side in the glow of the fire, no longer evidence of wrongdoing, no longer a symbol of accusation, but something else entirely, something that had revealed more about those who judged it than the one who had been judged. The woman moved then, stepping into the space where the fragments lay, and she knelt with quiet care, her hands hovering just above the stone before lifting one piece, then the other, holding them together for a moment, not to hide the break, but to understand it. Her eyes studied the line where the fracture met, tracing its edges as if reading a story written in silence. And when she looked up, it was not at Ethan, but at the chief, and in that look there was no challenge, no question, only confirmation. The chief inclined his head slightly, and that was enough. Ethan rose to his feet slowly, not drawing attention, not making a statement, just standing as a man stands when there is nothing left to prove. The circle did not close in again. It did not tighten. It widened, just slightly, enough for space to exist where there had been none before, enough for the shape of the moment to change. The boy remained where he was, watching, his shoulders no longer tense, his breath steady now, and when his eyes met Ethan's again, there was something there that had not been there before, not fear, not uncertainty, but a quiet understanding of what had passed between them in the canyon, something that did not belong to the circle, something that existed outside of law. Ethan gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but it was enough. The fire burned low, its light softer now, casting long shadows that no longer felt heavy, and the wind carried the cool edge of evening across the land, brushing past them all as if marking the end of something that had begun hours before. The chief turned away first, not dismissing, not ignoring, but simply moving on, because out here, justice did not linger once it had been reached. It did not explain itself. It did not ask to be understood. It simply existed, and then it allowed the world to continue. The warriors followed his movement, one by one, not in haste, not in silence that demanded fear, but in quiet acceptance, their steps measured, their presence no longer forming a wall, but dissolving into the land they came from. The woman remained a moment longer, holding the two pieces of the talisman, her gaze shifting once more to Ethan, and there was something there now, not gratitude, not apology, but recognition, the kind that passed between people who had seen the same truth from different sides. She placed the fragments carefully back into the dust, side by side, not joined, not repaired, but no longer divided by misunderstanding, and then she turned and followed the others without another word. Ethan stood alone by the fire for a moment, the open land stretching out beyond him, the canyon still holding the memory of what had happened, and he looked down at the broken stone one last time, not with regret, not with confusion, but with the quiet understanding that some things were never meant to be whole again, not because they were lost, but because they had already done what they needed to do. He turned then, stepping away from the fire, from the circle, from the place where judgment had once stood, and as he walked back toward the open land, the wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the faintest echo of the boy's voice, of the truth that had changed everything, and somewhere behind him, the two pieces of the talisman remained in the dust, untouched, waiting, as if the story they had revealed was not entirely finished yet.